Thanks very much, Heidi. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you should be seeing that screen now. So I'm Alastair Minty and worked with InControl Scotland for quite a long time now. And I'm just going to take you on a whistle-stop tour around some of my experiences around about institutionalisation in Scotland. Some of the experiences that I've had around about people and helping to move people away from the mindset of institutionalisation. And I guess that's one of the things that I want us to really concentrate on, is that it is a mindset rather than a place. So the first up in the top left-hand corner there, that's a picture of Ladies Bridge Hospital, which was a big institutional hospital in the northeast of Scotland. I did my training there as a nurse in between 1987 and 1990. So I'll just run through some of the points for the slides. Are some of the mistaken intentions. What is the thinking that got us there? So just thinking about some of the mistakes that made us think that institutions were a good idea, the uncomfortable prejudices that those things said about who people were and how they were viewed. Then really what the system did, what was the issues that were controlling people, and what the power of the institution looked like. And then really spend a bit more of the time on the steps we've taken to undo this, where we've started, where we've made progress, but also sometimes where we've made mistakes. So let's start off with the intentions and the assumptions. So obviously, I think universally the idea was that the institutions were places that were safe from exploitation, and that it was the public was the danger for people, and that people would therefore be safe if they were physically and shuttered away from communities, and that they needed this. This was the idea, obviously. And this obviously was based on those differences being labelled and responded to on a medical level. So people were judged and segregated. Sorry guys, could everybody put themselves on mute if they haven't? Thank you. Just getting a wee bit of background noise there. So there was an emphasis on protection and control, and we'll come back a bit later to some of the language that was being used. But a lot of management through drugs, and through compliance, through behavioural management, lots of 2-to-1, people getting very strong medications such as paraldehyde, and obviously back previously there was a lot of mistaken scientific knowledge as well, in terms of the eugenics movement, that somehow people with disability were going to dilute the gene pool, and we had to, so there was forced sterilisation going on, forced men and women being kept separate, and there was just such a massive impact on people's human rights. So sometimes there have been a few different projects throughout Britain, and there's been a couple in Scotland, one in Lennox Castle and one about Ladies Bridge, where they've encouraged people who used to live in or work in these institutional settings to tell their stories about what it was like. And I would say that it's quite telling that the differences between people's recollections of what actually life was like there, and whether or not it was a good thing to move to communities. So the picture on the left and the picture on the right are both pictures of the same building, And on a nice bright sunny day, it looks like quite a nice wee country place. But actually, the reality was pretty grim for people. You can find out more. There's a website called Ladiesbridge Stories. You can see a lot of the videos, and you'll see interviews by, like I say, some of the people who stayed there, and some of the people who worked there. Now, one person who worked there had said that it was the best days of their working life. And they said that the reason for that was there was no paperwork and they could do what they wanted. And in some ways, it was the fact that there was no accountability, the fact that people could do whatever they want, that led to one of the stories that one of the guys, Davy Jones, shares on the video. And he shares the story of one member of staff taking folk up the hills camping at the weekend, having a really great time, and another member of staff encouraging him and other young lads aged about 15 years old to punch each other, to fight, just for their amusement. And that there can't be much more of an obvious, I think, example of just how the level of the lack of accountability. Nobody was paying attention, nobody was caring. So you could do good, or you could do absolutely awful things to people, and it was invisible. So that is one of the key things that we needed to learn about the errors of institutionalization, was that people were being locked up, kept separate, and that abuse was invisible, but it was happening on a massive scale. So there was a massive amount of things that were wrong in that setup. One guy who was incontinent, for example, and nobody paid attention. There was very much a process-led, staff-driven routine. So one example of that was this guy who was incontinent, and they decided to do a program to help him to be continent, because, and it was driven by the fact that everybody had to have a support program in place. So they wrote this up, saying that they would speak to this guy every 20 minutes and asked if he needed a toilet, and if he was managed to be to not be incontinent for a whole week, he would go out for a bar lunch. Right, so this was, again, another thing that wasn't good practice, because it was a primary reinforcer, using food as a reward for doing things. It wasn't very ethical, but it was what they did at the time. The man in question had a very slow speech, so people generally didn't listen to him, didn't take the time to hear what he was going to say. So what happened was, within the first week, because everybody was stopping and asking him every 20 minutes, in the first week he was totally continent, because that was literally all it took, was for people to stop and to actually listen. Week 2 came and went, and they realized that he didn't have the money to go out for a bar lunch every week, because they hadn't thought in any way that this was possible. They had written this just to have something to write down. They hadn't actually believed it was possible, and so they stopped giving him the bar lunch, and so he stopped being continent. He basically, because he was so angry at the fact he'd been promised this, he started being incontinent again as his way of protesting. And this is some of the horrors that I think that we can sometimes lose sight of, is that just by listening, we can find out a lot of the stuff that makes sense to people and can make such a big difference. But often our actions still can be driven by the language, the priorities of the organization. So this was the language that was being used in the book that I, as a student nurse between 1987 and 1990, and this language was obviously out of date already, long before I started my training. So it was quite abhorrent, it was quite horrifying to me that we were still using this language, using this textbook. Now, this textbook was first written in the 1950s, and it had been updated. So this was the 7th edition, and the 7th edition had been updated in 1982. So it had got sections talking about things like community care and normalization. But if you looked through the sections about it, it sneered. It was looking down its nose at a lot of the points about community, and it still was very much about the medical model and had horrific descriptions of people and how to respond to people. It was all about that control, that element. So in the meantime, we were talking very actively about moving people out of hospital. So we had this very obvious split between the old thinking and the new thinking. One of my nursing tutors said that she felt we should be proud to be nurses. And lots of the students were saying, yeah, we should. And I said, it's not about being proud of our knowledge and that, it's about why should we be called nurses if we're working with people who aren't ill? What would be lost to change the terminology, and we need to make sure that we learn from that. So from an early age, I was causing a bit of mayhem and encouraging different ways of thinking. That one of our consultant psychiatrists at Ladiesbridge held an event in about 1990 called Against Normalization, in which it was the equivalent of a flat earthers convention. She was trying to pick holes in every aspect of community care and say it was just unrealistic. It just would never happen. And in a lot of ways, I was treated as a bit of a traitor, because what I was doing was, although I was a nurse, I worked in the resettlement team, and my job was to help people prepare for moving to the community. And that was about undoing the damage that we'd done, of recognizing that we needed to really focus in on people's privacy, dignity, human rights, their power, their control, and their relationships. One more example of somebody's life in hospital was a man who would spit out his tea. It was pretty much the equivalent of a hunger strike every night. He would spit out his tablets and they would get spooned back into his mouth 5, 6, 7 times. Then he would sit beside a man who he disliked, who everybody knew he disliked, who the staff had encouraged to learn smutty poems, dirty poems, and he would keep saying this to this guy. It was like a form of torture. And then he would sit in front of the TV watching programs that he hadn't chosen all night. And I asked the people of this ward, the people running the ward, why none of them went to this the hall, which was a social event, which was just literally 100 yards away, just across in the central building. And what I got told was that there were so many people in wheelchairs, it would take too long. So again, this was driving that one of the few sources of pleasure in the place and the chances to meet other people outside your ward was being denied because of people's mobility. So what I did was I arranged for people to, this was before much in the way of risk assessments. There was lots of really able people still within the hospital at that stage. And so I went to some of the other wards, and I got other people who residents from the hospital to help me to push folk across to the hall. And people actually had to have a rota because it was so busy, because it was so popular, because people had literally nothing else to look forward to. The guy who'd done the hunger strike stuff, who had spat out stuff every single mealtime, when I said to him it was his turn to go to the hall, he ate his tea, he took his tablets, and he went through for the first time in his life, and he washed his face, ready to go, because that's how excited he was to go. Now, at the end of my 3-month placement, the last day that I was in that ward was the last day that anybody went. Literally, it was all set up. It was actually easier for them for it to continue, but the message, and this is really one of the key things that I think is evident from institutionalization. Even if it's easier, if the institution decides that this is what's going to happen, that's what we see. We see people's rights totally being denied from them. So as part of the move then from hospital to community, we really focused on, it was all group homes in Scotland pretty much. There was very few individual tenancies. Part of this was down to, again, a systematic approach, that we had a cookie cutter approach to what was available, the funding. One part of this was that local authorities in Scotland could buy properties, and they could then lease them out on a 21-year lease back to organisations, and then they could claim back from the government 100% of those costs. But they couldn't claim back the costs for alterations. So what they did was they bought the biggest, most expensive houses so that they could get more people in. So it was, in general, a lot of, in the area that I was in, was 4 people in a home, but it was 5-bedroom houses because they had sleep-in staff. In order to buy 5-bedroom houses, they went to, because there was no limit on the amount of money that they could spend, what they went to was the affluent areas and bought most expensive houses, because that's where you found 5-bedroom houses. One of the massive errors of this was that there was a huge backlash from a lot of the communities, because people didn't want them there. It didn't feel like you were part of that community. And so that rejection, and one of the errors that we made in early days of community was that we thought by simply being there, by being around people in communities, that people would be naturally more accepted as part of daily life. But it turned out that we needed to be much more intentional about that, to make those connections. And it was much harder when you were in a place where a lot of the people were going and doing things that you weren't doing. So that was a huge issue for us. And we had to shift the balance to a much wider range of living arrangements and support arrangements. And that took a long time for us to shift. There was, however, certainly in the early 90s, there was a massive, really human rights-led push for person-centred planning. And although a lot of people felt that the move to community care had been one that was driven by the Tories, the Conservative Party, and by savings, actually most of the people who were doing it on the ground were really committed. They were really doing it for the right reasons, and they were pushing hard against the system. And some of the best practice that I've ever seen happened around about that time. And that was really a pushback against some of the stuff like aversion therapy, things like that you used to see written up, where punishment was down as therapy, time out. We had to really push against that, and we were into paths and maps person-centered planning, and trying to move away from that cookie cutter approach. So some of that stuff required a real shift in mindset, a belief in change. That starts with creating trust. If people can't see where their place is in this new world, they become incredibly defensive and they try and sabotage. And that's something that I've seen consistently. So when I was working with people in the hospital and they were saying basically, why would you be pushing for change? Why, if you're a nurse, why, you should be helping keep the hospital open. And my response was that people's lives were awful in hospital, truly awful. No privacy, no dignity, no human rights, no chance to do much of any meaning. And so I said that there's going to be a place for staff in the community. There's a need for at least as much staff. So if you can create an opportunity where you can help people to move and use the right thinking, there's a place for you there. But if you just dig your heels in, you might delay the closure of the hospital, and some of them did, but essentially there won't be a place for you because nobody is going to want somebody who's not interested in the community care values. So it was constantly about challenging assumptions and demonstrating what was possible. So one of the ways that we did that was in some areas, the move from institutionalization to community was based on a skills approach. So people would have to demonstrate a level of skill and capability before they could get out the door. If you can't tie your shoelaces, if you can't do this, if you can't do that, you can't get out. So we had to push hard against that and say that we had to start with where people were at, and everybody had the right to move out of hospital regardless. And that part of the demonstrating what was possible, what we did was we did trial stays with people. So people who were going to be going to live together in a group home, there was a respite house up in Cullen, which is one of the villages close to Banff. And we went for weekends and we saw how people got on. Now that was actually one of the most important bits of work that we did, because otherwise what was sometimes happening in other places was that people had no experience of being around people before they actually moved in together. And so that it was fairly disastrous to move some people in together who didn't know and didn't necessarily like each other with no preparation at all. Another example of the difference in somebody's behaviour is that there was one guy who was in a locked ward, and he had been so upset because people took his belongings off him in that ward that he would beat his head off the floor until he was bleeding on a regular basis, and would have to be moved and allowed to calm down. He would never lay his possessions down because people would steal his things. And the second weekend we were in this trial stay with other people, he relaxed and put his stuff down, and I actually had to show his staff member, his key worker, this happening, because he didn't believe this was possible ever. And I said that in 2 weeks, with the absence of the stressors of institutional life, he was able to relax. He could feel that this was a safe place. And this is what we were fighting against. People would not separate the person's behaviour in this setting, in a highly stressed setting, with what people were actually capable of. So quite often I was told that I was overly optimistic and that that this wouldn't happen. But actually what we were learning was, if you listen to people and treat people with respect, that actually it wasn't actually that complicated, but you did need to keep continuously learning and improving. So you never think that you've actually got there. Coming forward to today, institutionalisation isn't just a place, it's a mindset. I mean, this is a comment that really angered me recently, was that there's Richard Dawkins, who's considers himself to be quite the intellectual who's made lots of comments over the years about Down syndrome. And he said that given the amount of suffering in the world doesn't go down, probably goes up compared to having another child who doesn't have a Down syndrome. He was defending his statement in 2014 where he said to abort and try again if you were going to have a child with Down syndrome. This is a man who admits he doesn't know anybody with Down syndrome personally. And I just think that this shows that just below the surface, the eugenics idea, this idea of people being less than, people not being equal to everybody else, it's just hiding beneath the surface. John Dalrymple, who has just done a paper about human rights and institutionalization, indicated that he recently had a conversation where people were minimizing the impact, the dangers and the negativity of institutionalization in the past. They were trying to rewrite history a bit. And I think on a more positive note, we've got Fionathan coming up with quite a counter to that idea, just saying when you consider 499 out of 500 babies suffer from a lack of Down syndrome, my parents are incredibly lucky. And if anybody have ever met Fionn, you'll know what a powerful, powerfully positive young man he is. And the idea that happiness and contribution to communities is linked to intelligence is such an ignorant way of thinking of things that we shouldn't tolerate it, and we should be really aware of the backslip. So what are some of the other things that we're trying to do to move things forward in Scotland just now? We've got things like, obviously there's still a lot of person-centred planning going on. We've got to watch that doesn't become an institutional thing. It still has to stay pure to the individuals. There's still bigger institutional living arrangements being built in Scotland and not being challenged, despite the fact that we have really good legislation talking about self-directed support, giving really good guidance. InControl's been part of a programme called Working Together for Change, which has been about bringing together individuals, families, workers, local authorities, to try and get that shared sense of responsibility for this, so that everybody isn't working in their own little silos. Another thing that we've just started, and it's just very much in its early stages, is this. We've got a website called New Roots Home, and it's people who are interested in challenging any form of institutionalization, including helping people to avoid having to leave their home or their home area to go to live in institutional settings, or to help bring them back if they have been already placed out of area. And so these are some of the things that we're trying to do at the moment to make sure that we don't tolerate that backward slide, because there's been some real good progress, but equally there's still not that accountability, and there's still a vast variation across the piece in terms of the quality of self-directed support that's being offered.